Alright guys, my name is Goblin. Today, making a very quick video looking at all of the racial changes from Classic WoW going into TBC Classic. This is the first video in a series of new videos that I'm going to focus on TBC racials, evaluating their viability and performance for a number of different environments and classes. So if obviously you don't want to miss that content coming very soon, please do consider subscribing to the channel, as that really does help out. Like the video and then tell me what you think about the TBC racial changes in the comment section down below. But anyway, let's jump in. So first of all, let's begin with the Orc. So on the Horde side, honestly, the Orc is the only one that really gets some big changes to the racials, and the other races don't really have that much. It's actually more the Alliance side that gets a number of racial changes. In my opinion, they get a lot of racial buffs, whereas for the Horde side, they get, not a lot of changes or some nerfs to make the ratios on the Alliance and Horde side more balanced. There's this misconception that the Horde ratios are absolutely overpowered and totally trump the Alliance ratios, but in TBC they really did buff the Alliance ratios. We'll talk more about that in future videos. But anyway, let's look at the Orc racial. So first of all, we've got a buff to Blood Fury to also affect spell power and healing power. I think the total number at level 70 is 143. So this becomes the best in slot race for a number of casters, which will be interesting if they do actually release a fresh TBC Classic server, because it will probably mean that people will consider rolling onto an Orc rather than rolling an Undead. Honestly, this racial is actually better than some of the TBC spell power trinkets, and obviously when you stack these cooldowns together with trinkets and other abilities like Berserking, Bloodlust, all that kind of juicy things that are going to massively increase your caster spell power and DPS, it's just going to massively assist you in topping those DPS meters, particularly when you play a particular class that has an opportunity to snapshot their dots. So for instance, a Warlock can snapshot their Immolate just before they switch target. This obviously means that the dot will continue to benefit from the increased spell power buff long after the spell power buff has fallen off, and this also applies to melee DPS and hunters. And obviously the attack power buff isn't just melee attack power in TBC, it is just flat attack power, which means it also benefits hunters in TBC. But anyway, I think we've definitely talked enough about Blood Fury. The stun reduction hardiness has been reduced from 25% to 15%, so that's a little bit of a cheeky nerf. And the weapon skill buff has also been massively nerfed to only increase your expertise with the weapon by 5 points. So expertise, essentially what it means is it reduces the chance for the boss to dodge and parry your attacks, but if you're behind the enemy, he can't parry, so you will only get an extra 1.25% hit for most melee DPS when you are behind the boss. So it is more useful for tanks because you're always facing the boss, but a lot of time you are just behind the boss as a melee DPS. And yeah, this definitely is nowhere near as game breaking as an increased weapon skill like it was in Classic WoW. So this is honestly nothing to keep you up at night, it's not that great. It is still best in slot technically, but the main reason why people play an Orc if they're considering a melee DPS is because of Blood Fury, not the expertise ratios, because they're a bit meh. The racial command is totally unchanged too. So moving on to the other races, we have Undead. With Undead there's literally no changes, so nothing to talk about there. For the Troll there's a slight change. So instead of getting an increased weapon skill with your throwing weapons and bows, you actually get an increased crit, which is actually quite cheeky because you will be using a number of different bows in TBC. So this is actually a little bit of a buff, because originally it just increased the weapon skill of bows and throwing weapons, which wasn't really that impactful, but increasing your crit by 1% is quite nice actually. And then with the Torrent, the ratios are totally unchanged. Next we'll move on to the Alliance. First of all we have the Human. So first of all, the Spirit buff has been increased from 5% to 10% on the Human Spirit racial. Now the Mace and Sword weapon skill increase racial has obviously also been nerfed to only increase your Mace and Sword expertise points by 5. Talked about this when we were talking about the Orc racials. They're nowhere near as good as the weapon skill racials, unfortunately, so that is a little bit of a nerf. Honestly, the Spirit buff mainly just benefits a priest because they can use a talent that allows the mana regeneration to continue while in combat, and they do actually make use of the spirit stat. So it's mainly, and it's actually quite a cheeky bonus to be honest for a priest. Now let's move on to the dwarf. So first of all we have gun crit chance ratio rather than the weapon skill, so this is a definite buff. You may be thinking, well, is there actually that many guns available in TBC? And there is actually on the Alliance side, because first of all when you get exalted with Honor Hold you can get the Veteran's Musket or whatever it's called, and that is like the pre-raid best in slot gun for a hunter to get, which will last you quite a decent amount of time until you get the Karazhan first boss drop, which is also a gun. So there is actually a few cheeky guns out there that you can make use of, and it will obviously increase your DPS by a little bit. Next we have some changes to the priest ratio. So first of all we get a new priest ratio that is actually added in 2.3 called Chastise, and it's essentially a 2-second immobilization, a little bit similar to Ice Nova or the Wing Clip talent for the hunter, and what it does, it just roots the target in place for 2 seconds. Then it actually only has a 30-second cooldown. Now the person who's going to use this the most is a healing priest in arena, because you can't unfortunately use it in shadow form. It will break shadow form, and you know, if you imagine you're a healer priest, you're trying to run around the pillar, you've got a 2-second Ice Nova, which is insanely great life-saving ability. Plus you can use it to set up your Psychic Screams, and it's why many people actually consider the Dwarf Priest to be the best in slot priest for a serious PvP environment. Next we will move on to the Night Elf. So the basal racials are totally unchanged, however the priest racials are a little bit changed. So first of all we have Star Shards. In TBC, Star Shards has been totally changed to basically be a dot, okay, rather than a channeled ability. You know, and it costs 0 mana, which means if you're, you know, I think Night Elf Shadow Priests are going to be the ones who are topping the meters in a raiding environment, because they can just use this ability, just squeeze it in on a very short cooldown to slightly increase their DPS, totally free of charge. If you're a healer in arena, you can use it to add a little bit of DPS to the target, and you can also snapshot it with your trinket cooldowns. Moving on, we also have Elun's Grace. Chance to be hit by melee and ranged hits reduced by 20% for 15 seconds. What this essentially is a mini evasion. So I think it's a fairly good racial cooldown to counter melee and hunter abilities in arena. So I actually think the Night Elf race is actually pretty close contender with the dwarf race when it comes to priest options, but we'll talk about that more in a future video. And lastly we have the gnome, who only has one change to the escape artist ability. Instead of this being casted, it's actually an instant cast ability, which is obviously an absolute godsend, because having to cast it is a little bit frustrating and a little bit goofy. So it's a really decent buff overall. But anyway guys, that's where I'm going to end the video there. Like I said, there will be more detailed videos coming in the future about the TBC ratios, because there's actually quite a lot of different things to talk about. There's a lot of changes that we've covered in this video, and obviously we have to talk about their application in arena, which is a totally different world in TBC. So there's a lot more things to talk about than, you know, like there was in Classic WoW, where you just talk about them in battlegrounds and in a PvE environment. Now we have to talk about arena, which is a serious PvP competitive environment. So yeah, there's actually quite a lot to talk about when it comes to the racials. If you like the video, please consider subscribing, like I said before, because that really helps out, and there's definitely going to be more racial videos coming very soon. Anyway, my name is Medagoblin. Until my next video, ciao.